Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Gretchen Crosby Sims, the Executive Director at the IOP. We are truly delighted to welcome South Bend Mayor and Presidential Candidate Pete Buttigieg for a conversation moderated by the IOP's very own David Axelrod. As a reminder, the University of Chicago is a tax-exempt 501c3 organization. It does not support or oppose any candidate for political office. So we have invited all the major presidential candidates to campus to discuss their vision for the country. I can't help but note that we had Mayor Pete here in February, and it was right after that that his candidacy took off. So perhaps the other candidate schedulers should make note. I do want to mention a couple of upcoming IOP events. Next Monday, Admiral Michael Mullen, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, will share his perspective on the future of the U.S. relationship with Afghanistan in a conversation moderated by Jennifer Griffin of Fox News. Next Tuesday, New York Times reporter Tatiana Schlossberg will speak on whether so-called green consumerism is enough to protect the planet from climate change. She'll be joined by Robinson Meyer, a journalist with The Atlantic, who's a visiting fellow at the Energy Policy Institute at UChicago this quarter. And next Wednesday, Richard Stengel, former managing editor of Time magazine and former Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, will be at the IOP to discuss fake news and fighting disinformation in the 21st century. To learn more about these and other upcoming IOP events, please go to our website and sign up for our newsletter at politics.uchicago.edu. After the discussion, we will open up the floor to take questions from the audience. There will be 3 microphones, 2 on the lower level and 1 up on the balcony. Line up there, and please remember everyone's welcome at the mic. So if you're a first year who might be nervous about asking a question, especially of a presidential candidate, please know that we want to hear from you, and so does he. The Q&A period is the cornerstone of our events, and you're encouraged to come up. As usual, we do give priority for the first 3 questions for students. Now, please make sure your phones are on silent. And in a minute, you'll hear a formal introduction from Indira Kara. Indira is a second year from Simsbury, Connecticut, studying environmental science. This year, she is the logistics intern for the IOP Speaker Series. And this summer, she interned with Mayor Pete Buttigieg's campaign in Iowa. Please join me in welcoming Indira to the podium.
Today's conversation will be moderated by IOP Director David Axelrod. Before returning to his alma mater here at UChicago, Mr. Axelrod was a chief strategist and senior advisor to President Barack Obama. Mayor Pete Buttigieg was elected mayor of his hometown of South Bend in 2011 at the remarkable age of 29, embodying his belief in a new generation of leadership by becoming the youngest mayor of a U.S. city with more than 100,000 residents. In his time as mayor, he has prioritized technological and developmental advancements throughout South Bend, redefining ideas and conventions of the capabilities of an American small town. During his term as mayor, he took a 7-month leave to serve in Afghanistan as a lieutenant in the U.S. Navy Reserve. This year, Mayor Pete published his autobiography, Shortest Way Home, in which he describes the perhaps not so long journey he has taken to return to South Bend. Mayor Pete's presidential campaign has been defined by a dedication to reimagining the values of freedom, security, and democracy as liberal ideas and introducing a new and younger era of American leadership. This summer, I had the opportunity to work on Mayor Pete's campaign in Iowa. The summer itself was a whirlwind experience, and one I perhaps didn't truly know how to describe until I was reminded of a few lines from The Shortest Way Home. Mayor Pete writes, "A sense of loss inclines us in vulnerable moments to view the future with an expectation of harm. But when this happens, we miss the power of a well-envisioned future to inspire us to greatness. The problem politically is that we keep looking for greatness in all the wrong places. We think it is to be found in some grand national or international adventure when the most meaningful expressions of American greatness are found in everyday life." Organizing for Mayor Pete was centered around this idea, that there is greatness to be found in every day, in a connection and an act of understanding difference, in music, and the belief that we've not lost our ability to talk to each other. Mayor Pete teaches us that our true power comes from the beauty of community, the beauty of the shortest way home. It is my honor to introduce the mayor of the city of South Bend and candidate for President of the United States, the Honorable Mayor Pete Buttigieg.
Thank you.
Mayor, welcome back.
Thank you.
You were here in February before you actually became an official candidate, and I see you're playing bigger rooms now.
It seems that way, yeah.
Yeah. Do you ever stop and say to yourself, how the hell did this happen?
Every now and then.
Go from here to there. I mean, you know, you at that time, you were essentially an asterisk.
Well, maybe a little more than an asterisk.
You were an asterisk plus.
I'll take it.
But you were, you know, largely considered one of the flock of many, small-town mayor, young guy, so on. And now you're a contender. And what have you learned about the country? What have you learned about yourself through the journey from there to here?
Well, the biggest thing I've learned is that you arrive presenting something that's different if you're not like the others, and you can get your ideas across that anything can happen. We didn't know. I believed, but didn't actually have any way of knowing as of January or February that if we did this, that we could build a following, that we could get the resources we needed to compete, and that we could attract a movement. And that's proved out from the announcement in April through the debates. We've been able to advance past the first 20 or so of my competitors. Now there are a few of the biggest hills to climb ahead of me. But what it tells you is that for all of the problems, and there are many in our system, there's still some level at which the system makes it possible for people to break through. I mean, the idea that a 30-something gay South Bend, Indiana mayor would even be taken seriously was a bit of a leap. And I also think it tells us about the moment we're in, because frankly, somebody like me doing something like this probably would not have gotten this far at any other moment in the history of the Republic. And
Well, describe the moment that you think makes it possible.
well, I think it's a moment where a lot of our assumptions and orthodoxies and rules have been shattered, or at least called into question by the emergence of Donald Trump. But that a lot of them actually are going to have to reassert themselves. In other words, the idea is not that there are no rules. The idea is that some rules have been broken and others are going to reassert themselves. We just don't know which yet. I think we're also in a moment where there's a desire for something that is really new and different, and yet not new and different in the way the current presidency, obviously, is new and different, but rather a response to the fact that we're in between moments in American history. I think we're in one of those moments that's hard to read precisely because it falls in between chapters. I would date the current era that's coming to an end to the election of Ronald Reagan, roughly the time I was born. And that has gone on really for 40 years. I think Democratic and Republican behavior has played within certain boundaries of, you could call it the Reagan era, the neoliberal era, the Washington consensus, whatever you want to call it. And now it's blown up under Trump, who is both a symptom and a cause of this unraveling. And now we got to figure out what's coming next. And that means that if you arrive with an account of where America is and what you want to do, people will hear you out, even if you don't have the traditional credentials of a mainstream presidential candidate.
What do you, Trump obviously looms large over all of this. What do you think that his effect is? And when you talk to people, you know, there is this big debate, the debate about, is this a time for bold, as Elizabeth Warren says, and she's done very well with it, bold structural change, or is it a time to heal the country and restore some sense of calm and common purpose and some of the things that have been shattered? What do you hear when you're out there?
I hear both. And I think
you are a politician, aren't you?
No, but this is this is really important. This is why I'm running. So we have to have bold change, because the failure of our political and economic systems up to now is what got us here. A guy like Donald Trump should not have been able to come within cheating distance of the Oval Office, should not have been able to take over either one of America's two major political parties. The fact that that was even possible, I believe, reflects the failure of our system to keep up and deliver for people. and the failure of our system to really make everyday life better in America, which is why we need real changes. It's also the case that we need to heal. So I'm thinking a lot about not just the need to end the Trump presidency, but I'm thinking about what it's going to be like the first day after the Trump presidency. You may have seen in the debate, I asked voters to really picture this and not just enjoy and savor the idea of, thank God he's no longer in office. But I mean,
not even for a day?
Maybe for half of a day. But then really think about what we're going to be up against at that point. None of these problems will have gone away. The problems that he exploited in order to become president. They're not taking a break for impeachment or the Trump presidency or anything else. Meanwhile, we're going to be even more torn up by politics then than we are now. Thanksgiving dinners will be a minefield. Our communities will be that much more frayed and pitted against each other. And a big part of the job of the presidency is to get people together across all of that. Now, I'm not saying this in some mealy-mouthed, let's forget all our differences and we're all just going to get along kind of way, but in a really, like, we've got to at least agree that we're part of the same country kind of way. And the president, often through the least well-documented functions of the presidency, the symbolic parts of the presidency, can uniquely help make that possible. So the premise of my campaign is we can enact very bold reforms and also do it in a way that can unify an American majority, which, contrary to a lot of the assumptions that I think Democrats have had beaten into us over time, an American majority that's with us on issue after issue and engage it to get things done. If we have to choose one or the other, we're screwed.
You talk about where we'll be the day after, and that's assuming that he's not president, and he could be president, but if he's not, there is this theory that, and it's sort of based in experience, that he might not go quietly, and that he will raise doubts about the process, and that he will stir his base to question the legitimacy of an election. Let's imagine you are the president. How do you deal with that? Healing is a word, but what are the things that would have to be done to reassure people about the responsiveness of our institutions and to invest people with a sense of kind of common purpose, even as we have differences?
Yeah. Well, I think the work that has to go on right away is to make sure our institutions actually reflect us. Not that we have majority popular rule on every decision, but there should at least be some resemblance between the decisions that are being made and what the American people want. And again, you can see this across various issues, but the issue behind every issue is democracy. The fact that districts are drawn where politicians effectively choose their voters, certainly the role of money in politics. I would argue the existence of the Electoral College itself. All of these anti-democratic qualities, some of them that have been there all along, some of them newer, that have been used to grind our system's responsiveness to a halt. These need work right away, and it has to be it's never sexy, the process stuff is not sexy, but that's got to be done right alongside dealing with climate and wages and racial inequity and healthcare if we want to advance as a country in our lifetime.
So you think you would restore unity by moving to eliminate the Electoral College?
I think that it's one example of, no, this is important, right? Think about this. If we had a national popular vote, we'd all actually be participating in the same election for president, which is actually not true right now. And we need to stitch together the way our community problem-solving processes work, the kinds of things I work with as a mayor, all the way through up to the national level. Now, I'm under no illusion that we can get a national popular vote overnight, but part of what I'm trying to do, in addition to making the case for a policy I think is good, is elevate our ambition a little bit about democratic structure, because it's so clear that our democratic structures don't work. And perversely, even though he's making them worse, I think that Trump's arrival largely reflects a sense of frustration about those structures. For example, in his campaign, he said the elections are rigged. Now, in one sense, that was a lie, because he was saying that it was undocumented immigrants by the busload showing up at precincts, and I've never found anybody who thinks that happened at their precinct, even if they think it happened. But in another sense, if the outcome of a congressional race is effectively predetermined by gerrymandering, then in a certain very transparent, naked, and real way, that's true. And so the things he was saying that weren't true often rhymed with something that was true and tapped into this more general desire, I think, to burn the house down, which is why all of the racism and the misogyny and the xenophobia in his campaign found such fertile ground. It's this lethal mix. And if our institutions continue to be this encrusted and non-functional, then I really think no matter how clever the policies we come up with on health or climate or wages or whatever, we'll continue to see this disconnect that will empower whoever is the loudest and promises most convincingly that they're going to burn the house down.
I'm interested in what you hear when you're out campaigning. You do a lot of town hall meetings. You meet with people all over the country. You spend a lot of time in Iowa. How often does, electoral college reform and redistricting and those things come up as opposed to healthcare, job security?
No, it's much more likely to be about that. Healthcare for sure. And it's not just the things that are getting debated constantly, like Medicare for all versus Medicare for all who want it versus some other fix on coverage, but also things that haven't made it as much into the debates, like the simple fact of affordability, how prescription drugs are paid for, the cost side of things. So that's clearly a big issue. There's a sense, I think, that even though the economy is being described as good, it's harder and harder, not just to get ahead, but to hold on to what we've got. I think a lot of folks are finding their pay is level, maybe up a little bit, but nowhere near the growth in the cost of retirement, health, education. And there's this desire to know that the president's actually going to work on that. Certainly housing, yeah. So these are the things I hear about. A little bit more about things like impeachment, but even now.
Yeah, I was going to ask about how much you hear.
I used to hear
because it is obviously such a focus of a lot of the news coverage, but it's not the focus of the interactions you're having with voters by and large.
Yeah, I used to hear it, in a day full of campaign events, I'd hear it maybe once across the day. Maybe now I hear it almost once per event, but not quite. But it's not the dominant. If you're trying to figure, bless you, if you're trying to figure out, to me, politics is about how the decisions made in Washington are.
That was a staffer, by the way, planted there. I know these tricks.
That's a good one. I thought of that. Politics is about whether your life will go different if I'm president versus somebody else. Now, I actually think that will be true of democratic reforms I'm pursuing. For example, your lives would be very different if we had a national popular vote, in the sense that you would have had a Clinton instead of Trump presidency and a Gore versus a Bush presidency. But more to the point, more to what's on voters' minds right now, your health care, your wages, your ability to get and keep a good job, cost of housing, retirement. These are the things that are going to propel so many of the decisions being made.
It's such an interesting thing. When I was in the White House and the economy was recovering from this awful crash, we always struggled because there were signs of progress in the macroeconomy, but people weren't feeling it in their lives. President touts, as you would advise, perhaps he should, that unemployment is at a 50-year low, and some of these other macroeconomic signs, but people aren't feeling it, and sometimes when you push too hard on that, it actually creates a backlash.
Yep.
Where people say, well, maybe it's good somewhere, but I don't feel it.
Right. Think about it this way. Life expectancy in the United States is going down. How is it even possible to have GDP going up and life expectancy going down at the same time? It tells you something about where that economic growth is going and whether it's making us better off.
I don't want to leave your own experience as a candidate. You were talking to some students earlier, and you said you were asked what most surprised you about this, and you talked about the physical toll of campaigning, and you seem reasonably fit.
Thank you.
But talk about.
Yeah, no, it is. It's physically demanding in a way I didn't understand getting into it. It's as somebody watching news coverage of candidates, I never really believed them when they said it's a grueling process. But now I get it, and it's hard even now to explain exactly why. but something about the constancy of the motion and just the sheer number of places you go and things you do in a day. It demands a lot of you. This, by the way, actually I think is also the answer to the question on age that has been surfaced, sometimes in some kind of indecent ways, which I think is, obviously I think there's value in a new generation as the youngest candidate. But I'll say this, if you can survive a presidential election, then you have the energy, I think, required for the
No, I
presidency.
think that's right. I think it's a gauntlet. And I think campaigns are actually auditions for the role, and part of it is, can you run all the events? Can you meet the physical demands of it? And part of it is, the better you do, we were just talking about this, you're doing better now, and now the things you say and do actually get a lot more attention, which creates more pressure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and people are quicker to point out anything that they think you did wrong.
It's only going to get worse, brother, I'm just telling you.
No, but the pressure is healthy, right? I mean, again, as you say, it first of all, it emulates the pressure that at a different scale the president will experience. It allows you to demonstrate what you're made of. People, I'm probably dating myself here, but the scene in Officer and a Gentleman where they put them in the low oxygen environment, they're training to be naval aviators, you know what I'm talking about? And they have to do this simple task involving playing cards, I think. You have to put them in order or something. And they become just giddy and stupid because they're not getting oxygen. I think that's kind of how the presidential campaign process is.
It's encouraging for the Republic.
Just in the sense that when you see somebody, for example, a candidate, do something, you say, like, that was really dumb. I could have known better than to say or do that. And that's probably true. The question is, if that were the 17th time in a 1 hour space that you'd had to do some kind of task of that complexity, could you still have done it right?
Yeah.
And that's where I think candidates get tired or reveal their weaknesses, is just because it's not any one of the things you're doing that's hard. It's doing all of them at once every day for 2 years.
I have to laugh that that's how you think you're dating yourself. And when I say I'm dating myself, I mentioned Casablanca. But
you see how few heads nodded when I brought up the movies. I'd explained Seinfeld to Chasten. It was really...
I want to ask you, I thought maybe your best moment in the debate came in your discussion from the perspective of someone who has worn the uniform of the country, your reaction to what's taken place in Syria. Yeah. Since that time, your old friend, Vice President Pence from Indiana, was dispatched to Turkey, and an agreement was reached that really seemed like a kind of capitulation. Right. Evaluate where you think we are at and what the ramifications of it are.
Well, it's incredibly disturbing because, first of all, the outcomes on the ground are troubling. It was essentially Turkey getting its way, and we have very little indications of what the long-term implications will be when it comes to ethnic cleansing of the Kurds and when it comes to a potential reemergence of ISIS, which is, of course, why we're so concerned about the region to begin with. But also, beyond all of the things happening on the ground, there is permanent damage to American credibility. And the thing that hurts so much as a veteran is to think about all of the people who, around the world, as we speak, are putting their lives on the line because they think aligning themselves with America is a good idea. And that often requires a lot of courage. I remember being deployed, not only the Afghan National Army folks you would see, but just everyday workers. There was a guy who I would swap stories with about, I was trying to learn Dari, and he would teach me Afghan sayings.
Because you don't speak enough languages?
Well, it's useful out there.
Norwegian doesn't work there?
Not very useful. Actually, not very useful at all, because most Norwegians speak better English than we do. So his job basically was just to clean up this building where some American and allied elements worked. And I got to know him, and we bonded by discussing corn, because he was from a part of Parwan province where they grow corn. I'm from a part of Indiana where there's a lot of corn. It gave us something to relate over. And he was also explaining how his family was vulnerable to kidnap threats, and would be much more so if anybody in his village figured out what his day job was. So just not even a fighter, just a guy going about his life, mopping the floor. And he's risking his life by working with American troops. And if I were over there now, I don't know how I could look him in the eye after what we just did. That is going to cost us in so many ways that we haven't even seen yet. Because there will be allies who could be doing things precisely so that we don't have to send troops in somewhere, who now won't even want to talk to us. And if we're not a credible partner, a credible ally, we've also stripped our own service members of their honor. A lot of the comments coming back from interviews with special operators, soldiers, and Marines who are out there is about the level of shame that they feel. And if you take away the honor of a service member, there is very little left, I think. That's why this is so disturbing. It's not just that it's a terrible policy decision in the Middle East for this moment. It's that it could take decades to recover the credibility that was blown up for no really good strategic reason. It's not like the president was faced with this anguishing choice that is where presidents earn their paycheck, where there is no way to honor one value without betraying another, no way to live up to a promise to one ally without undercutting another, or no way to save American lives here without endangering them there. No.
You don't think he went through that process?
I don't even know, the word process doesn't seem like it could apply here, right? And, you know, for so long, especially with my more conservative friends, the debate over whether this president's a good guy or a wise thinker or an honest man ended a long time ago. The debate, and maybe you've had this experience if you're on our side of the aisle and debating somebody on the other side, making excuses for the president. Somewhere along the debate shifted, somewhere along the way, from whether he was a good leader to whether it mattered. Maybe you got this kind of retort. It's like, well, yeah, he's crazy, or he is loose with the truth, as folks will sometimes very gently put it. But how much is that really going to matter? Washington's this enormous thing. There's all these people work. Well, now we know. Now we know the deadly consequences of a president who doesn't know what he's doing, doesn't keep his word, and as far as I can tell, doesn't care. People die when that happens, and people are dying right now.
Let me just ask you a political question, as someone who's out there in the country, and you yourself has talked as someone who's served about the need to end endless wars. Mm-hmm. That is the argument that he has made. Yep. This is their problem. Right. It's not our problem. It's 7,000 miles away. Yep. He will find an audience for that, yep. Will he not, with some number of Americans?
Yeah, but it's a really perverse argument, because the extraordinary thing that was happening in northern Syria was that a tiny number of U.S. troops, I mean, we're talking a few dozen, were able to stand between that region and the things we're seeing now, the beginnings of a genocide and the reemergence of ISIS, just by having a few people there. And what's so ironic is, for those of us who think we've got to get out of Afghanistan, this is what getting out of Afghanistan ought to look like, is that you have a skeletal presence of special operators and intelligence gathering capability, just enough to keep America safe and to stand between that place and the worst possible outcomes, not an open-ended and large number of ground troops. This is exactly what we had in Syria, which is why we didn't have to have a large mobilization of troops into Syria, and he took it away. And you can see the consequences of taking this tiny number of, I mean, far fewer than the number of people in this room, and taking them out has unleashed something that we may be dealing with for years.
I want to go back to this issue of bold structural change,
yeah.
Senator Warren's term, and she has an array of proposals that are large-scale proposals mm-hmm. to deal with inequality and some of the other issues that I think people in this room probably care deeply about. You challenged her in the debate over actually one that where she's borrowed a proposal from Senator Sanders, but talk about that and why it was important to you to challenge her on that, what you think you learned or what we learned, and what we should think about that.
Yeah. So the reason I think this is important is rooted in my experience as a mayor, where you say things in a campaign, and then they put you in charge and you actually have to deliver them. And I think anybody who allows the phrase Medicare for all to escape their lips in campaign season has a responsibility to explain what it would actually take to get there. So I think it's striking that on the highest visibility domestic issue in the Democratic primary, the current Democratic frontrunner has not detailed how it would work, other than to speak to Senator Sanders' plan. And the concern there is that it effectively means within 4 years, we're throwing a switch, everybody on private plans loses them. And there's a big hole in how it's supposed to be paid for. And the reason I think it's so important to illustrate this difference is I'm convinced that we can get that same goal of getting everybody delivered. It's not like I'm proposing some little technical tweak. I am proposing the biggest reform to healthcare in this country in 50 or 60 years. Medicare for all who want it. That's what I call it. So the idea is you take a version of Medicare, you let everybody get in on it, if they want it. And if you want to keep your private plan, that's okay. Now, I think a lot of people who tell pollsters
How much would that cost? Or would it, how would you finance that?
Yeah, so the great thing about doing it in this way versus having all of it go through the Treasury right away is that you can do this without tax increases on the middle class. Now, you will have to roll back the Trump tax cuts. We're going to have to close loopholes on corporate taxes. But these are things we should be doing anyway, because I don't think those tax cuts should happen in the first place. And the 1% will have to pay more, for sure, both in terms of income and in terms of wealth tax. But don't worry, they will still be very, very rich. I'm not saying we don't have to come up with revenue. But I'm also committed to making sure that everything we propose in my campaign, we explain what the revenue is going to be, because I think deficits matter. Republicans said that they cared about deficits, especially when they were trying to stop us from investing in anything. And then they took power, and it turns out they don't care. They blew up deficits more than we've seen in recent memory. And that means if Democrats don't get into the business of worrying about these fiscal questions, then nobody cares about it. And maybe it's a generational thing, but I think the longer you're planning to be here, the more likely these fiscal time bombs could go off on your watch. So I think it's important to explain how it's going to be paid for. But the other thing is just,
but you
really
can pencil it out. You could hand me a piece of paper and say, here's what it would cost, and here's how it would be paid for.
Yeah, I don't have it on me. But no, and we're continuing to keep score for every promise that I make so that we can show that there's a pay for, so that it's at least budget neutral. We actually think our prescription drug plan will be budget positive because there will be a savings to the Treasury when we're negotiating with pharma companies on the price of drugs. But the really important thing here is this is what Americans actually want. So here you have a majority of Americans backing an extremely bold progressive reform, only for some of my competitors to say that we've got to do something further that most Americans don't want.
Do you think that could cost the election?
Well, it certainly won't help. Because, again, a lot of the people, including Democrats, who would tell a pollster they're for Medicare for all, what they mean is actually what I'm proposing. They're for Medicare for all, where they get to keep their plan if they want it, which is why, and somewhere along the course of this year, it became the case, at least in the commentary, that Medicare for all has to mean their version, which is Medicare for all whether you like it or not, which is why I started calling mine Medicare for all who want it, just to clarify that to me, the way to get everybody health care is one that still allows you to have private plans if you want. And I think the more people discover that her vision and Senator Sanders' vision takes that away from you, the more trouble we're going to have. And
Are there other issues that could create those problems?
Well, I think again, the remarkable thing about the moment we're in is that there's a big American majority for a lot of major progressive reforms. But there is a point where I think it's too far for a lot of folks. And I come at this in terms of what the right policy is. But I also think the politics will follow that. You think about college is another area where I have a difference. I think we should absolutely make college free for low and middle income students.
Yeah, by the way, what you call the very rich, we call trustees, okay? So.
And again, I promise you, they will be just fine. But those trustees' children, should they go to college, I think they can pay their own tuition. I don't think we need to make it free for absolutely everybody. I think we should make it free for anybody who would face this as a barrier. I just think that's a better policy. I also, though, think that it speaks to an allergy among just a lot of Americans to the sense that we're going too far in the direction of free things, because of course nothing's free. It's a question of who's paying for what for whom.
There is a resistance to this word of free. I mean, this is my clinical analysis based on, some years in this work, is that people, there is a sense that people should have skin in the game.
Yeah.
It's sort of interesting. I was talking to Governor Raimondo from Rhode Island about this, and she had a branding issue because she wanted to make community college free, but the word free, she said, was offensive to some people. Let me ask you about your own progress here. You're making obvious progress in Iowa, which is where this whole process begins. What do you have to do there, by the way, do you think, to keep your momentum going?
Well, I think three things matter. One is whether you have the resources to just go the distance, because these operations are expensive. We've got that. The next thing is, do you have a message that's resonating? We feel that we do. But there's still a lot of Iowans who don't really have an opinion of me or some of the other candidates, because maybe
they're living their lives.
Right, they're not actually following the minute by minute, blow by blow of the presidential nomination process, because they got stuff going on. And then the third that's so important is the ground game. So, when the Iowa press said we won the steak fry, I'm sure this
which is a big event in Iowa, where a cattle call of.
Yeah, and there's no objective measurement for how you win the steak fry.
One way is you buy a lot of tickets and get a lot of supporters here, which you guys did.
Right.
So that's part of the organizing task.
Right. So what it really means, because it sounds like this very superficial thing, right? But the reason it actually matters is the organization that you're test driving to get people out to cheer for you at the steak fry is the same organization that's going to be turning out caucus goers on caucus night in Iowa. And so putting that organization through its paces. There's another big event. There's a dinner in a couple of weeks. That's the kind of Iowa State Democratic dinner. This is a key moment for Obama as a candidate.
Yes.
I'll be giving a speech along with each of the others. That's going to be very important for us. And we just got to keep returning and showing up and cultivating that support. As some of the other candidates maybe fall away, it becomes a much crisper set of choices, and voters who are keeping their powder dry make up their mind. That being said, I believe that a serious share, possibly even a majority, of voters won't really make up their mind until the last 10 days.
Yeah, which is not unusual in the Iowa caucuses. If you get past that, you go to New Hampshire, you seem well positioned to do well there if you do well in Iowa. Once you get past that, now you're getting to states with large numbers of African American voters. South Carolina looms fourth in the sequence. You're not doing well with African American voters. You're negligible would be, or asterisk would be close to the way to describe your support there. Why do you think that is? And why do you think that is?
Well, first of all, voters need to feel that they know you. And one of the things that's clear, we get a great response whenever I'm addressing majority black audiences about our agenda. But there are also a lot of folks, especially in a place like South Carolina, who want to feel like they really understand you and know you. And so our challenge and our task is to build that familiarity very quickly. Right now, the former vice president has an overwhelming advantage among these voters. But I think one of two things is true. Either it's because he has the best answers on the subject of race, or it's because that trust and familiarity is playing a big role.
And his partnership with President Obama.
Which is part of that, yeah. If the latter is true, then I think other candidates can build that trust by making clear what we stand for. And I think that's our pathway forward. It's what's allowed us to win over audiences one at a time, and I think that's the long run. Now, the other thing is, you got to show you can win. This is especially important for voters who are skeptical of newcomers. And so in many ways, more than I think the commentariat probably has assessed up to now, a big part of how you can be viable in South Carolina is to prove in a place like Iowa that you can win.
Let me ask you two elements of this. The first is you had significant turbulence in your campaign earlier in the year because of a police-involved shooting in South Bend. How much do you think that retarded your ability to grow? And on that point, you had a story, an unwelcome story today, that the former corporation counsel for the city was a co-sponsor of an event, and I guess you're speaking at today, a fundraising event, had given you the max and helped raise money for this event. You had to return that money. Should that have happened?
Yeah, so it should not. And as soon as I found out about it, so this morning, just to be clear, the reason this is such a concern is that this is somebody who's involved in the Laquan.
I'm sorry, I should have filled in the blank.
And,
yeah, he was the corporation counsel
right.
when the city was withholding the tape of
right. And
Laquan
look,
McDonald's shooting.
As somebody, especially as a mayor of a city that has had a lot of anguish over police-community relations, I believe very strongly that transparency and justice for Laquan McDonald is a lot more important than a campaign contribution. So I learned about it this morning, and within about an hour of that, he's no longer involved in the event or in the campaign.
But this reflects a vetting.
Yeah.
One of the things about raising money is you then have to create an infrastructure to evaluate potential donors to avoid stories like this. So this is a growing pains story.
I think that's not an unfair way to put it. Yeah, we started this campaign with 4 people in January as an exploratory committee.
How many do you have now?
At least 100 times that. And so
I'd hire one more and put them on vetting.
Noted. Look, this is important, though. You're right. This is important because it reflects on the campaign. And we have roughly 600,000 people who've contributed to the campaign. And when somebody contributes, especially at a substantial level, you need to make sure you've gone through those steps to be sure that there's no concern that would make you regret that they were associated with the campaign, even if it's not somebody that you've interacted with directly.
Getting back to the main issue, though, you had an event in Bronzeville here, which is predominantly African-American community. The audience was predominantly white. You just haven't broken through. I want to ask you a really sensitive question, which is, I remember from the marriage equality debate when I was working with the president and so on, the most resistance that we faced was among Democratic coalitions, was among older African-American voters. You're the first openly gay candidate for president, and how much of a barrier is that for you, and how do you overcome that?
It's there. I think there's a process going on in the Black community in general and the African American churches in particular around this. But I can't think about it in terms of its effects on me as much as I think about it in terms of its effect on LGBTQ youth of color, who often really rely on their churches as a place to go for help in difficult times. And I think that it is in the name of compassion toward youth who really need their churches to be there for them that a lot of progress is currently happening on this issue.
One of the concerns I hear, because I think you took a big step forward in that debate, and people are beginning to look at you and say, well, maybe this is possible. But the concern that you hear from people is knowing the way the Trump operation works, that he will weaponize this and try and retard turnout in the particularly in the African American community, in races that could be marginal
Yeah, of course.
races?
I mean, look, they're going to find something to weaponize against everybody. And if there isn't something there, they'll make something up and use that. That's what they're going to do. But it's also the case that if we have the right message and build the right coalition, this race should not be close. It should not be within cheating distance. They're going to do all kinds of nefarious things.
Yeah.
Of course they are.
Cheating distance is an interesting choice of words. I want to go to questions in 1 second, and there are microphones. I think there's one in the balcony, and there are microphones, or there will be. Here comes the microphone. There's one down the main aisle, so why don't you begin lining up? Is there one in the balcony? And one on this side over here. So wherever you're closest, line up. I don't know, did you see Saturday Night Live last Saturday? Yeah, I know you're busy. Yeah.
Yeah, I saw.
So Colin Jost, it was not really fair, was it? Because I have a feeling that he must know you, right? You guys must have been classmates.
Yeah, I knew him. I think we lived in the same dorm. I didn't know him very well, but I knew him a little bit in college. So it's one of those strange...
What did you do to him that made him so mad?
No, it's all in good fun. I mean, obviously, if you're being played on SNL, something in your life is probably going the right way.
Yeah, exactly. I didn't see Steve Bullock on that skit. So
maybe next time.
Or others. I like Steve Bullock. I'm not. Anyway, yes. I bet before I get into more trouble, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Nathan Muntz. I'm a second-year medical student here at UChicago. My question is, the racial wealth gap is, due to hundreds of years of slavery followed by hundreds of years of discrimination. What are you going to do specifically to close that racial wealth gap?
Yes. So, first of all, we got to recognize that if you take a legacy of racist policies and structures, and you replace them with neutral ones, it's not going to lead to equality. We've learned that the hard way. I would say on some level, I've learned that the hard way. And if you stop and think about it, it's very clear why. Think about it in terms of compound interest. You save $1, turns into $2, and then $4, and then $8. Over 150 years, $1, 5% becomes $1,000. Well, if that's true of the value of $1 saved, it's also true of $1 stolen. And when not just $1 or a number of dollars, but the entire economic life of people has been stolen in generational theft going back to 1619, this is not something that will just correct itself. It compounds. And in many ways, the fact that some of these harms happened hundreds of years ago doesn't make it better, it makes it worse. You add to that the fact that some of these harms did not happen hundreds of years ago. The exclusion, the de facto exclusion from the GI Bill, the fact that it was more difficult for Black Americans to access Social Security benefits, housing policies within the lifetime of my parents that segregated neighborhoods that actually started out integrated at the beginning of the century. These intentionally and through the government on behalf of the American people compounded inequities and led to the racial wealth gap and the racial income gap. So what do we do about it? First of all, I'm a supporter of H.R. 40 to investigate reparations, and that conversation needs to happen. I also don't think we should wait for that in order to take certain steps. And so I've proposed the Douglas Plan. The idea is, it's named after Frederick Douglass, who demanded that our country be closer to living up to its professed ideals. I think we should call it a plan and name it after a person to remind people that it could be as ambitious as the Marshall Plan, except this time, let's invest it right here at home. And it's one of the reasons why, in addition to things that get often the most discussion when it comes to problems around racial inequity, like inequity in our criminal justice system, I'm also really focused on the solution side, solutions coming from within the Black community in entrepreneurship, for example. So I'm proposing that the federal government have a 25% goal for business done with businesses led by people who've been historically excluded. It's why we're proposing a Walker-Lewis initiative that would provide what we call a debt for jobs guarantee to remove the debt for Pell-eligible students who start small businesses. A lot of people face what's informally called a black tax, basically the fact that an entrepreneur of color is more likely to be expected to fund relatives and support family members because of that same wealth gap you're talking about. So whether we're talking about entrepreneurship, access to credit is another big piece that needs to be reformed. Whether we're talking about criminal justice, because of course having a parent incarcerated is something that makes someone less likely to meet their potential later on, which is one of the reasons why we need to decarcerate. In addition to health and a new Voting Rights Act and home ownership, all of these things are tied together. And I believe because the disparity is systemic, the solution has to be systemic too. And I don't want to be too long-winded, so there's a lot more on the website, but these are some of the measures that I think we need to undertake, frankly, all at once. The last thing I would add is that there's a conversation that needs to happen among white Americans. This can't be something that is only raised as a sort of specialty topic for black audiences. And frankly, it's very important not to only hear about this from candidates of color, because there's got to be a way, without arousing some of the defensiveness that a lot of people have, to talk about how everybody is implicated in this problem and how everybody can be part of a reparative or restorative process to make it better in our lifetimes.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, up there.
Hi, yes. My name, up here. There we
Oh,
go.
there you are.
Great. Okay, hi, my name's Devin Wenzel, and I'm a second-year English major, and as such, I just really like asking cool people what their favorite novels are. So it's like not political, but if you want to give me some book recs.
Yeah, all right. First of all, I'm proof that you can study literature and then have a job. So, right, good on you for being an English major. I've talked elsewhere about why I think Ulysses is the ultimate personal and political novel that explains a lot, because it's actually about the everyday, even though people think of it as being about complicated things. I just read Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin, very timely novel. I am just dipping into a history of Rome. It's about how republics die. It's a little grim. One of the things in there is that when the consensus-building institutions of a Senate, for example, are ground to a halt for obstructionist purposes, that's one of the symptoms of a republic starting to die. So also a timely book. I think it's called Mortal Republic. Chaston got me this book called Finnish Nightmares, which is basically it's these cartoons kind of evoking Nordic social anxiety that I find for some reason I can relate to. I don't know if they have that at 57th Street Books, but those would be my picks for the moment.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. Yes, over here. Perhaps you want to ask about film.
Oh. I'm a public policy major. Hello, my name is Jaden. I'm a second year in the college. Nice to talk to you, Mr. Mayor. My question is related to the police, the police tensions within your city of South Bend at home. I'm not like the gatekeeper for like all black relations between like white people and black people, but I do think it is like a legitimate claim for black people to be hesitant to throw their advocacy behind you, with, especially with the tenure of your police chief a while back and some of your comments about All Lives Matter. So I'd like you to like speak on those just a little bit more. I know Mr. Axelrod touched on some of it, but yeah, I'd like you to talk about that just slightly more if you could. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm mayor of a diverse community that has a past and a complex relationship between communities of color, especially the black community, and the officers sworn to keep them safe. One of the toughest moments in that relationship came early in my tenure. So I had interviewed 3 candidates to be my police chief and wound up selecting a chief, African-American chief who had served under my predecessor, largely because he was very strong in community policing. Later on, we got a visit from federal investigators about an investigation going into some of his actions and things that were going on in the police department related to wiretapping of other officers. And I reached the conclusion, parts of this are still being adjudicated in the courts, but I reached the conclusion that I couldn't have him continue to serve in that role if I had found out, not from him, but from federal investigators, that he was the subject of an investigation like that. It was a trust issue in our relationship. The concern that followed from that, and a lot of pain in the community, really demonstrated to me in ways I think before I had only understood in theory, some of the things that are at stake in the relationship between black residents and the police. And while there's been a lot of good work done in terms of making sure that we, for example, empower residents and citizens to weigh in on policies, we built a transparency portal so you can literally look up what's going on with cases of use of force or complaints just alongside what's going on with data around crime so that people understand what's happening under the hood of our policing. Efforts that, some of which are still a struggle, especially around recruiting. Post-Ferguson, recruiting minority officers has become even harder, and some of our numbers have moved in the wrong direction. But some things that have worked very well. A level of accountability that has really risen on my watch when it comes to expectations for officers, that I think demonstrate that it hasn't been perfect, but that every step we've taken, we've done together. And it's helped me to understand what's at stake in having a White House and a Department of Justice that is serious about racial equity in policing. So as we were going through these very painful steps in our city, during the Obama administration, I could reach out to the White House or the DOJ for help. Right now, we've got a DOJ that has made it abundantly clear that civil rights is not its priority. And it changes a lot of things, both for departments that frankly need to be enforced on when it comes to civil rights. Now, that's not happened to us, but it's happened in a lot of cities. And departments that are trying to do the right thing but need help and are on their own, to the point that we've actually been, we're moving to engage people who had worked in that previous Department of Justice and are still working these issues to help us, because we know we're not going to get help from Washington today. So those are some of the steps that we've taken, and they motivate the policing element of what I believe is an important plank in the Douglas Plan. And these issues are going to be with us for a long time. They didn't start on my watch, and they won't end when I leave. But if I can't promise that we've been perfect on these issues, I can promise that I have walked with the community in pain through these and understand what's at stake in getting it right.
I'm going to go back up the other way, so go ahead.
Hi, my name is Isabel, and I'm a first year in the college, poli-sci major probably. I actually asked this question to David Axelrod and the IOP fellows earlier in the school year. So I'm really interested in terms of campaigning and issues that straddle political reality and actual reality. So, for example, someone who lives by the Mexican border, who's a blue-collar worker, might feel that immigrants are taking their jobs, even though we know that's not that's not true. Yeah. Whereas someone in New York City who's a lawyer might, be very welcoming to immigrants. So, what are issues that we can run on? In the election that unites us as Americans and that kind of straddles these two different realities that people live in?
Well, I think the best thing we can do is connect it to realities on the ground. The great example for this, in my view, is the political trajectory of the Affordable Care Act. In 2010, it was a deadly issue for Democrats. We got killed over it because it was all in theory. And so these stories about death panels and all these things, people believed it. By 2018, it was the winning issue for Democrats for the simple reason that it had actually happened and people realized they were better off and weren't going to allow their members of Congress to take it away from them. And so even on the toughest social issues, I find they get a lot better when it's connected to somebody's lived experience. Immigration is a great example, actually. In South Bend, we had an undocumented immigrant who was a business owner get deported. And people were furious that he had been deported. And by the way, he was from a very conservative part of our county. And all of the people demanding that I do something to stop this, which of course I really couldn't as a mayor, were conservative Republicans. His own wife voted for Donald Trump because they really didn't see it as something that was going to affect somebody like him. And you can say, well, what did you expect, and be mad at them. But you got to remember that if you're on a diet of Fox News and you're from a community where being Republican is the same thing as being respectable, you just didn't see this coming. But the more we're talking in terms of actual lived experiences, the stronger we get. There's the example about election rigging, too. I know plenty of people who think that there was a busload of undocumented immigrants voting somewhere, but I've never met one person who thinks it happened at their polling place. And the more we can make it about the realities that we live and breathe and see, the better off we're going to be. I think it's for exactly this reason that the president wants us thinking about things that are far off and strange, like whether we should buy Greenland, right? Because the big problem in your life, if you're sitting at home trying to figure out how to pay the bills, is probably that you're not getting paid enough or that healthcare is too expensive. Not that we haven't bought Greenland. And so we need to make sure that that tether allows us to build the common ground that already exists on issue after issue. Even issues where Democrats have been in a defensive crouch, like guns. There's actually an overwhelming consensus, even among Republicans, that we should at least do background checks. And because while most people, thankfully, don't personally have the experience of gun violence, they at least have the experience of being worried about their kid going to school. So lived experience, I think, is the touchstone that's going to get us out of this, if our nominee has enough discipline to keep lived experience at the center of the message, even as all of these dazzling and horrifying things happen around us.
And do you have any idea who could do that?
I got a thought.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Daniel. I'm an American Jew, and it's very important to me that Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territories end, not in spite of my Judaism, but because of it. We have 4.8 million Palestinians who are living under the authority of a military over whom they can't exercise any accountability. And to me, this is despicable in terms of the Jewish principles of love and humanism that I was raised on. You've said in the past you believe the occupation must end, and I'm glad that we agree, but the United States gives over $3 billion in military aid to Israel each year, much of which funds the occupation, so there's a deep complicity in this nation.
I have to ask you to get to the question.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's clear that we need real action. So my question is, as president, will you make aid to Israel contingent upon an end to the occupation completely?
So what I'll say is that I think that the aid is leverage to guide Israel in the right direction. And if, for example, there is follow-through on these threats of annexation, I'm committed to ensuring that the U.S. is not footing the bill for that. One of the shocking things to me about the absence of American leadership under the Trump administration is not just what is happening among our adversaries or competitors, what's happening with China or Russia, throwing their weight around in the way that they do, but our allies. After all, Turkey, behaving the way they are right now, is also a NATO ally. Saudi Arabia is doing things that I don't think would have been permitted before, and I think it's partly because we're not using our leverage as an ally with them. And I think the same is true with Israel. Look, I believe in the relationship with Israel. I believe in the alliance. I believe it's important. I also believe that it is in the American interest, as well as the Palestinian and ultimately Israeli Jewish interest, that Israel not reach the point where there will have to be a choice between either being a Jewish state or being a democracy. And there is a trajectory toward that going on right now. So I'm not going to commit now to all of the ways that that leverage can and should be used, but I will say that our policy goal will be to do what you do when a friend is moving in a way that you're worried about, which is to put your arm around your friend and guide them somewhere better.
So you won't condition aid completely?
What's that?
You won't condition aid completely?
I'm not going to put that string on aid today.
So
I just have to, we got a bunch of other people here, so I'll take one more from there and then I'm going back to the balcony. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Lexi, and I'm a fourth year in the college. I'm also one of less than 12 Native American students in the college, and I'm a citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. So I was wondering, do you have any sort of specific plans for Native Americans, considering we're one of the most marginalized and least represented, if ever represented, minority groups within the United States?
Yes, and thank you for speaking to this. So one thing I'm very proud of is that the first time federally recognized Indian country came to the state of Indiana was in South Bend. And it was in the context of a 30-year struggle on their part, but also alongside a partnership that we formed with the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi Indians, who were the first nation in our area. And I learned a lot about tribal sovereignty and the struggles that exist right now. First of all, a lot of tribes or tribal citizens who have fallen out of the protections of tribal sovereignty, which is why we need a fix to the Carceria decision. There's also chronic underfunding of the Indian Health Service, and there's been a failure to recognize free, prior, and informed consent on things that impact tribal lands, which is how you got things like the Standing Rock situation. I will also say that when I visited the Obama White House as a mayor, it was very clear that there was a relationship with mayors and cities, there was a relationship with states, and there was a relationship with tribes. This was considered a very natural part of intergovernmental relations. And I believe that we need a White House that recognizes in its structure and its practices, as well as through our policies, those relationships, because they're extremely important for tribal citizens who are also American citizens. By the way, disproportionately likely to have served in the military as well. And we have a lot of obligations built up over a long period of time that we will honor when I'm president.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to grab 2 more questions, one from the balcony and one over here. So why don't we start up here?
First of all, thank you so much for coming. I'm Gabe Broshi. I'm a 4th year studying public policy and statistics. I wanted to ask, what differentiates your Medicare for All Who Want It policy from the other public option healthcare policies the Democratic candidates are proposing, and why do you think it's a better policy?
Great. So there are a number of features, and with an eye on the clock, you can read faster than I can talk, so you can see more of the guts of it online, but I'll mention a few things that I think are important. One is our approach on affordability. We make sure that there is a cap on how much of your income can go toward premiums, 8.5%, and then we also have the subsidies to make it possible for anybody to afford coverage. Another thing that I think is important is, frankly, philosophically, I would like for this to guide us toward Medicare for all or single-payer environment. It's just that I think we need a little bit of humility to discover by doing whether that's going to be the right answer for everybody, instead of assuming that it will be and requiring everybody to embrace it. In other words, if progressives like me are right, that the public alternative is going to be better, then everybody's going to opt into it, and it becomes the single payer. But I don't want to risk other people's health care on us having gotten that right in Washington, nor do I want to risk other people's health care on us having correctly guessed the number of years it would take to get there in Washington. Is why I think it's important for us to create this alternative. And then if the private sector comes up with better things than they have now, fine. The important principle to me is not that the government be your payer, your insurer. The important principle to me is that you get good coverage one way or the other. But I do think that's a philosophical difference from folks who feel that they're just adding features onto the framework of the ACA.
Yes.
All right, hello. My name is Marissa, and I'm a student at the law school. So because of that, I had a question about the Supreme Court, and I thought some of your ideas were pretty interesting. So I think there's concern that any new, Supreme Court scheme could kind of threaten the independence of the court and maybe open the door for some even more, partisanship. Maybe the Republicans would come up with their own court packing scheme next cycle. So I just wanted you to maybe elaborate on some of your creative ideas you floated and any concerns that it could open the door for more partisanship in the court and how serious you are about them. Yes,
so this is really important. The idea of reforming the Supreme Court is not to make it more liberal. I will make it more liberal with the people I appoint to it, but that's not what structural reform should be about. On the contrary, the purpose of structural reform should be to make it less politicized. And that's got to be the core of any reform we undertake. That's why if we are going to expand the number of members of the court, the idea that I floated is one where 1/3 of the court can only be seated by unanimous consensus of the other 2/3. In other words, you have 15 justices, 10 of them can be appointed through the traditional political methods. Then the other 5 can only be seated by unanimous agreement of the other 10. By the way, I'm not smart enough to have thought of this on my own. For folks who are interested, there's an article, I think in the Yale Law Journal, about to come out that explains why this might be something that could be achieved without a constitutional amendment.
That's a law school in the East, right?
So I'm told, yeah. So that's probably the most ambitious reform. Others have been floated would be term limits. If you have an 18-year term, then you know how many vacancies there will be per presidency. It dials, but that doesn't dial down the politics really that much. Another is to rotate people off the appellate bench. I'm not going to be doctrinaire about the idea itself. I do think we need a sense of urgency around reform. And we need to remind ourselves that reform is an option. The Supreme Court has been adjusted many, many times over our history. I would argue that the Republican Senate changed the number of justices to 8 until they took power again. But it's also been reformed in much healthier ways. As recently as the 1970s, there were constitutional amendments happening all the time to improve our government. The 25th Amendment, changing the voting age to 18. Even amendments that didn't make it, like the ERA, although I haven't given up on the ERA. But the fact that that fight happened had very good consequences in terms of leading to things like Title IX. So this is a moment where obviously our political structures have not kept with the times. And that means calling into question whether the United States has the right number of states, whether the United States Supreme Court has the right number of justices, maybe even whether the US House has the right number of representatives. Not in order to make government more liberal. That's the job of liberals, to go out in the political space and do and argue for, but to make government more responsive before its unresponsiveness leads to pathologies even more disturbing than the Trump presidency.
Did you say whether the United States has the right number of states?
Yes. Look, if you're...
This isn't just some cheap play to get Indiana to merge with Illinois, is it?
No, I think we're all set on our side of the state line, frankly. No, but the idea that if you're living in D.C. and you're a dishwasher and you don't have a representation in the Senate,
100%,
there's no principled defense of this. By the way, it would not be the smallest state if it became a state, but what it would be is the most African-American state in the Union. So that's an example. And you know, if the people of Puerto Rico decide to be a state, I think we should welcome that too. I also don't think we should wait on that to have electoral votes for Puerto Rico, because I think if we did, it would be less likely that the disgrace of the response to Maria would have happened. So the point is, there's some basic structural things that we used to revisit from time to time as a country, and we've just lost the muscle memory to do it over the last 40 years or so. And I think it's time for a new season of structural reform to our democracy itself.
Let me just say before we let you go, how much we appreciate you being here. And I want to say to all of you how much I appreciate you all being here. This is going to be an enormously consequential election. And we have, through the Institute of Politics, and now a campus-wide effort called UChai Votes. Our hope is that everyone on this campus registers and votes and participates, because the decisions you're going to make, or the decision that will be made this year, is going to impact dramatically on the quality of life and the future of our country that you are going to live, as Mayor Pete likes to speak about. What's your line about when you're as old as the current president is? 2054?
2054. I think it's 2055 now. But
I see.
yeah, the thought is just that when I reach that current age of the current president, I want to be able to look back at 2020 and say that's when things started getting better. And I think it really will be decided in these years coming up right now whether our climate is going to be one that can sustain us, whether systemic racism will either finally be wrangled down to size, or whether it will finally drag down the entire American project. Whether we can build an economy, especially in this new machine age, where it actually works for everybody, or whether numbers on a page go up but most people don't feel. These things are about to get worked out for us. And this will go down as one of the most consequential times in the history of the Republic. And it's exactly why we need some imagination and a spirit of boldness coupled with unity. And I just refuse to accept that boldness has to mean beating everybody else over the head and crushing them into submission. I think boldness means having answers that are going to work and gathering that majority to get it done. And this is our chance. This might be our last chance. And that's why I'm running.
And it's all up to you, but no pressure. So thank you very much,
Mayor.
Mayor.
Thanks very much. Thank you. All right.